and welcome. Welcome to Dignity in Dying's webinar, Last Rites, What Should Dying Look Like in the 21st Century? Thanks for joining us for what I hope is going to be a really thoughtful discussion. I'm Sarah Wootton. I'm the Chief Executive of Dignity in Dying, and I'm also co-author of Last Rites, the Case for Assisted Dying. I'm delighted to introduce you to Alison Jean Lester, who is author of, amongst other books, Absolutely Delicious, A Chronicle of Extraordinary Dying. And of course, we have long-time Dignity in Dying campaigner Anne Whaley, whose husband Geoffrey died at Dignitas last year. So we're going to hear from Anne and Alison about their experiences, and then we're going to move to questions, and you'll be able to ask your questions too. But before we start, I want to go through a bit of housekeeping. Because we've had over 500 people sign up today for today's webinar, we're not going to be able to see or hear you, but I encourage you to get involved by asking a question. You can do that by using the Q&A function, and that might be at the bottom of your screen or somewhere else, depending on the device that you're using. You can ask a question at any time, and we'll try to answer as many as we can later in the seminar. When you're asking your question, can you try and be as brief as possible so we can include as many as we can? And also to be clear that we've disabled the chat function because of the number of people here today, but the Dignity in Dying team might post messages to you during the seminar, so you can have a look. If you'd like to share your thoughts on social media during or after the seminar, then please can you use the hashtag #LastRites. So for me, in retrospect, this year of the pandemic has been the perfect time to look at the UK's problems with death and dying. We've all had to reflect on our own mortality. Death and dying is everybody's business now. In Last Rites, the Case for Assisted Dying, I and my co-author, Lloyd Riley, set out what we considered should be a new standard of dying, based on honesty, on choice, and on compassion. We questioned why dying Britons are forced to choose between 5 options: Switzerland, starvation, suicide, sedation, or suffering, when over 200 million people have access to better laws, laws which help them to talk about and to plan for how they want to die. So Anne, can you start by telling us more about which of those 5 options Geoffrey was forced to choose and the message he left behind for members of Parliament?
Yes, indeed. Because of the police intervention, just literally a few days before we were due to travel, he made an instant decision that once the police had left, he was going to cease eating. That was the only way. He was paralysed totally with motor neuron disease, so he couldn't do anything else but stop eating. He wasn't on a ventilator at that stage. His breathing was in fact deteriorating, but but what I'd like to do, if this is okay by you, is to read a letter that my husband wrote to all MPs literally just before he died, and it was sent, and it is as follows. He sent it to all members of Parliament, and it was entitled, "By the time you read this, I will be dead. On Thursday, the 7th of February last year, I will have taken medication that will end my life. Surrounded by my wife Anne, my children, and a couple of my dearest friends at Dignitas in Switzerland. With their love and support, I've been able to fulfill my final wish to be in control of my end, rather than endure the immense suffering that motor neuron disease has in store for me. I want to impress on you the anguish that my family and I have experienced, not because of this awful disease, but because of the law against assisted dying in this country. The blanket ban on assistance has not only forced me to spend thousands of pounds and endure months of logistical hurdles in order to secure a peaceful and dignified death overseas, but it has meant that my final weeks of life have been blighted by visits from the police. Since my diagnosis of MND, an incurable terminal illness, in 2016, I felt as though bombs had been dropping on me. I gradually lost all use of my limbs. My ability to speak, swallow and breathe began rapidly deteriorating, and I knew that death was inevitable and unavoidable. But I remained strong for my family. I simply wanted to cut this suffering short by a few weeks. And when I eventually got the acceptance from Dignitas, a weight lifted, and I was able to get on living without the constant mental anguish over my death. But then, as I was saying my final goodbyes and preparing myself for the end, the final biggest bomb dropped, and I could no longer keep it together. This was an anonymous phone call to social services informing the police of my plans to go to Switzerland. Within hours, we were facing a criminal investigation, and the thought that I might not make it to Dignitas, or that if I did, Anne might be facing 14 years in jail for helping me, was too much to bear. The law in this country robbed me of control over my death. It forced me to seek solace in Switzerland, and then it sought to punish those attempting to help me get there. The hypocrisy and cruelty of this is outstanding. Though it's perfectly legal for me to travel to Dignitas by myself, the minute anyone assists me in any way, and this being essential due to my condition, they are liable for prosecution. And I had a chance a week before my death to speak to some MPs and peers about my experience and my adamant wish that the law should be changed. The overwhelming reaction was one of agreement, but despite huge public support for an assisted dying law, most members currently oppose it. The law being proposed was limited to terminally ill, mentally competent adults in their final months, with strict inbuilt safeguards to protect the vulnerable and anyone else incapable of making a clear decision of their own volition. One MP who expressed opposition to a change in law was unable to articulate an answer when I pressed her on why she felt people like me should be denied a say over our own deaths and be forced to suffer. I want MPs to know that the change is urgently needed and it is achievable. Over 100 million people in the American and Australian states and Canada are covered by assisted dying laws that allow choice to dying people and protection to others. No family should ever have to endure the torment we have undergone in recent weeks, but it will be easier to bear knowing that by sharing our experience, we can contribute to future change. And I sincerely hope you will truly listen to our story and see that the suffering you are inflicting by upholding the status quo. Yours sincerely, Geoffrey Whaley. Well, last February, my husband, Geoff, died peacefully at Dignitas in Switzerland. He died on his own terms as he wished, avoiding a protracted end from motor neuron disease, but it came at enormous personal, emotional, financial, and legal costs. And I have spent almost 2 years campaigning with Dignity in Dying for a change in the law in this country. Geoff was first diagnosed in December 16. A few months earlier, we had celebrated our golden wedding anniversary with our family on an activity weekend. Geoff, at 78, had enjoyed the Go Ape and zip wire across the lake with our teenage grandchildren, sliding down water chutes and cycling up and down the very hilly terrain. His diagnosis was a shock and shattered our world. It was terminal, and we were told Geoffrey had only a matter of months left. Within 48 hours, he had decided that he wanted control over his own end, and he started getting all the necessary documentation in place in order to obtain the green light to go to Dignitas in Switzerland, if ever he should decide that the time had come. He made no secrets of his plans, all our friends were told, as well as our GP and his consultant at Oxford. He sent a group email explaining what he'd got, how he intended to cope, and told everyone he'd be delighted to hear from them, but under no condition were they to ask how he was. He would talk about anything except for his health, and he included a link that explained all the symptoms and the progress the disease would take. And by and large, his many friends abided by his request, and when he couldn't hold a phone anymore, they spoke through me. When he finally lost all use of his limbs and his voice, swallowing and breathing began to fail, he asked me to book the final flight and hotel in Switzerland. acts that could be considered as assistance and therefore a criminal offence under the Suicide Act of 1961. His plans to go quietly were scuppered by an anonymous phone call to the social services accusing me of domestic abuse and the arrival of the police at our door shortly before we planned to travel. We were terrified. After being questioned by the police that evening, Geoff decided he would starve himself to death if control of his end was taken away, and he refused food from that evening. The emotional stress and worry that my passport might be taken away and prevent Geoff from having control is not something I would wish anyone else to experience. The police knew within minutes that our case was not one of domestic abuse, but the law meant that it had to be looked into, and it took 7 full days for the case to go through the Crown Prosecution Service to the highest level of complex cases before it was dropped. I am now on police files, and technically the case could be reopened if new evidence came to light. And all this because I respected my dying husband's wishes. Prior to police investigation, Geoff had many obstacles to overcome in order for him to get to Switzerland. He had to produce all the necessary documentation for Dignitas that took months to achieve, using voice apps when the use of his hands declined. He had to provide evidence that he was of sound mind and settled intent, that he was in the terminal phase of MND, along with residence, birth and marriage documents and transfer monies across to Switzerland. Everything had to be procured secretly, without revealing Geoff's motivation. The cost involved with Dignitas' annual membership fees, the appointment itself, the flights, a 3-star hotel with disabled facilities, taxi transfers to and from the airports that cope with wheelchairs. Dignitas is over an hour's journey away from Zurich Airport, meant that there was not much change out of £14,000, and we are well aware of how fortunate we are to be able to afford this. The practicalities of dealing with travelling with a completely paralysed man without the aids available over here, it's immense. No carers to help, hoists, hospital bed, commodes, sliding sheets, etc. in the small hotel recommended by Dignitas. And my last night with Geoff reduced me to tears. I couldn't turn him or lift him, get him to the toilet, sit him up to help him drink. He was far too heavy for me to haul around, and I cried all night long. And on the night before he died, a Swiss doctor who had to write the prescription for the medication came to our hotel and spent over 30 minutes testing Geoff's mental attitude and competence. And at the end, I said, "Do you ever send anyone home at this late stage?" And he replied that if Geoff had in any way indicated that as he was now here, he might as well go through with it, he would have put us all back on the next flight home. Next morning, Geoff's final moments at Dignitas were very peaceful. He died in my arms in a matter of minutes after taking the medication himself through a straw. And his last words to me were, "I love you so." We desperately need a change in the law so that people like Geoff can have an assisted death at home in this country with strict safeguards and without the threat of police investigation for families who are simply supporting their loved one. We should have assisted dying facilities in our homes over here for those persons in the terminal phase of their illness who have medical proof of being of sound mind and settled intent and who are able to take the medication themselves. Palliative care is of no help at all to people in certain conditions. My local hospice admitted they could not do anything for Geoff. Change is urgently needed, and this is achievable. My darling husband did not fear death, but he did fear the final journey. If assisted dying could be made legal here, well, Geronimo, as Geoff would have said.
Geronimo, indeed, Anne. Thank you so much. I mean, I remember, do you remember meeting an MP called Alex Chalk
Yes.
last January? So he's
Yes.
now Under Secretary of State for Justice, and he actually wrote to a constituent this week to say that meeting you and Geoff was one of the most profoundly moving experiences, quote, that he's had as an MP, and hearing you tell that story shows us why. Thank you.
I have a huge ring binder file with 4 letters in every sheet from MPs and peers, including the Prime Minister, Theresa May. It's amazing. And from retired doctors and palliative care nurses, all who support him. And that was very, very moving.
Well, I hope we get a chance to say where we are on the campaign. Before we do, Alison, I found Absolutely Delicious to be a brilliant account of the contrasts between each of your parents and your aunt's deaths. And I felt it very much showed how dying can be better approached if you think of it as something that's just another phase of life, and also that you're prepared to confront it honestly. I was so impressed by your mother's quote on getting the news about her liver cancer not having decreased but in fact multiplied. And I hope when my time comes I'll have the same kind of attitude. She said, I think you asked, does it feel unreal? And she said, it's not that it feels unreal, but that it doesn't matter. As you said, she owned the train taking her out of here. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit more about Absolutely Delicious and your personal views of death of dying as a result of your experiences?
Absolutely. And I'm very moved by hearing Anne talk about her experience with her husband and feel a real correspondence, because my parents were very open, and in Jeff's letter, you can see how clearly he laid out what he wanted, and clearly to his friends as well. And you said he told everybody what he wanted so that they knew exactly what to do. My parents did the same, and what a privilege it was as the daughter. We are a small family, and the onus was on me and my brother to help them. My aunt also died last year. My father died 10 years ago, my mother and my aunt last year. My aunt had no children, so my brother and I also were responsible for supporting her. The main chronicle of the book, Absolutely Delicious, A Chronicle of Extraordinary Dying, is the narrative of how my mother went about it. But there are chapters also on my father and my aunt. They were different and so informative. My mother feeling that getting the prognosis that wasn't good and having it not really matter was this incredible, sweet acceptance. She had seen other people go through the end of their lives. She was an only child, so she was fully responsible for her parents' ends, and those had been very bad. Her father had Parkinson's, and that was a hard way for him to go. He didn't like how it went, and he was angry. Her mother had Alzheimer's, very difficult to control, very difficult to watch, almost impossible to actually manage. You know, you don't know what is wanted if it hasn't been expressed. So my mother was determined to make sure that we had an easier time with her death. I like to say she retired. She was a very busy woman. She was a very, very project-oriented, creative writer and sort of busybody. And she had many, many projects. And when she felt she had concluded them, she finished a novel the week before she moved to residential hospice. She retired, and she didn't know how long she would be there. It ended up being 9 weeks. She died in Massachusetts, which does not yet have an assisted dying law. And that's part of the problem. I think that had she not been in a position, the hospice is not free in the United States. It certainly wasn't. The facility that she went to she was on a daily rate for it. So she was quite concerned about how much it was going to cost, not knowing how long it was going to take. So that is definitely a consideration, access to the ability to be taken care of the way you want to die. Had she not had the funds, had she been able to say, this is going to kill me and I might struggle, that would have been helpful. But we had the groundwork laid by my father for this sort of philosophical death is inevitable and must be, if you can embrace it, embrace it. However, like Jeff, my father had MND, what we call ALS in the United States. And he also died in Massachusetts. And because there was no assisted dying law, and because he was unwilling to let MND have its rather revolting way with him, well, very revolting. I don't know why I pulled that punch. Because of everything shutting down and difficulty breathing and swallowing and choking, you could hear him eating was so difficult, right? He actually started opening up to us about what his options were before he stopped being able to walk, actually, even before he could still walk with a Zimmer frame. He told me he had been thinking about the helium option. The downside of that, like it seems very peaceful, except that he couldn't do it unaided. We wouldn't be able to tidy away the bag that you would put over their head and the helium. He couldn't do it, he'd be dead. So we would have to do it, and that would then be assisting, as you say. So eventually, as a result of more work, more research, he came upon a video of a fellow who had chosen to refuse food and drink and starve. And that fellow had cancer and asked us to watch it. And it's actually a beautiful video because of the man's attitude. I think he had a beautiful attitude, and it was an embrace. It was a true embrace of an accepting death. Again, it has to have support. He had the ability to hire an aide to take care of him, so that his wife could just be wifely, didn't have to be a nurse the whole time. My father and mother were living in a retirement community then, so it was a very easy living. There are, nurses could come and go, and he chose a hospice organization that understood what he wanted, and we learned to understand the doses of morphine and Ativan and all the various things that made him more comfortable. But we didn't know how long it was going to take. This is the thing. I mean, with my mom's, obviously, we didn't know how long it was going to take, but that didn't matter as much. We wanted him not to struggle like he would struggle. Mom knew with her cancer, she had initially melanoma that metastasized to the liver and then to the brain. But her understanding of it was that she would get weaker and weaker, and she was okay with how it was going to take her. Dad was not okay with how MND was going to take him, more understandably. So he would rather, starving to death was a better option, frankly. But again, you don't know how long it's going to take. Beg your pardon?
A least worst option.
That's it. It was a least worst option. And I was living in Singapore at the time, so I knew I had time to get there. I knew that he wouldn't have died if I didn't get there on the day he started, because I, finish work and go. So that was a blessing. But had he had the option to choose the day then he would have been more able to participate in that last day with us. He faded away, and then it was just a wait. I do think that if my mother had been in pain, she would easily have taken up the fasting to death option, but she wasn't in pain. We all knew it was an option that she might take if she had seen that she was really suffering, but she was blessed with a very, mild side effects from the cancer other than dying. But she enjoyed her last 9 weeks. I think this is, how could dying look in the 21st century? Could it be enjoyable? My mother enjoyed it, and that is what I wanted to chronicle. My father found out how he could enjoy it, who he wanted there. What would we do? We looked at photographs, we played music, we took him outside as long as he could go outside. My mother said to him, and it got harder and harder to interact with him, but he wanted to know we were around. He was happy just for there to be a bit of hubbub, we would take turns going out to eat in order not to put food in front of a starving man, not to have the smells in the house. But my mother said to him, how is it? And he said, ideal. Can you imagine being conscious and knowing that the way it was going was ideal, and what a gift to us. So with that being an option, so for my father, fortunately, it worked out really well. Starving doesn't work out really well for everybody.
No.
So what if it could be that you said, my last couple of weeks are going to be horrible. How about we have a really sweet time? You know what this makes me think about more and more the last several days? I had my children, I had 2 babies in Japan. And, you know, you talk, I don't know if you did this, but you develop a birth plan. You have this like ideal birth plan, and you decide what you want, and you let your doctor know. And half the time, you know, it probably won't go that way, but it's a nice idea. But the fascinating thing was that having your child in Japan as a foreign woman, they expect you to be not quite as strong as a Japanese woman. So on the same ward, I could hear Japanese women having their babies on the other side of the ward, of the corridor, and the midwives would be saying to them, "Come on, shite kudasai," which is like, buck up, you know, come on, hold on. And then they would come in and they'd say, "And now would you like your epidural?" No, I'm fine. Like, but they'd asked me, if they asked me once, they asked me 5 times, "Is it time for your epidural yet?" So had I thought that I was going to struggle too much, even if I wasn't struggling, I could have one. I just had to say, could I have an epidural? And they wouldn't even ask me if it hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I not able to have a death plan? Why shouldn't I struggle during childbirth, but I should if I'm dying? I don't understand that at all.
Completely agree, Alison. I mean, I was really struck by the quality of your conversations with your parents, the plans that you made in advance, and the documentation of it. And I think that's what an assisted dying law does confer, the ability to have these conversations in an upfront, open, transparent way, without having the kind of wall of silence when everyone is trying to not talk about the elephant in the room and protect their own livelihoods. If they're doctors, they're basically having to abandon patients and who are trying to work it out for themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that assisted dying actually extends life, because having that choice gives people control. You've actually both mentioned control and how important it was. So Brittany Maynard, who was a campaigner in the US, I don't know if you've heard of her, and she was born in California but went to live in Oregon so she could have an assisted death. And she said that you know, it's given me, knowing I've got the option has given me such peace. Otherwise it would be dominated by fear and uncertainty and pain. She had a brain tumor. And why do you think it's this reassurance? What do you think it is about the reassurance of knowing how you're going to die, whether you choose, however you choose to do that, be it an assisted death, be it not? Why do you think people need the reassurance of that?
Because they know you're going to have a good death. Then you're not going to suffer unnecessarily. And again, it's a question of choice. But as soon as Geoff got that green light, it was a huge weight off his shoulders, because he could then concentrate without constantly worrying, I'm going to choke to death, when's it going to happen, and how's it going, you know, it's going to get worse and worse, and it's just going to be terrible. Once he got the green light, he could put all that aside, put it in a box, put it away, and enjoy what quality of life he had left.
And, I think we can open it out to some questions now. So if everybody wants to submit their questions, I'm going to ask a couple while you're typing them in. And remember, just use the Q&A function to type your questions in, and I'll read out as many as I can. I just want to ask about the pandemic, because obviously we're here now. And I think if we'd been there when you two were caring for your loved ones, I mean, Anne, you know, lockdown would have made traveling abroad impossible. So, you know, for Geoff, he wouldn't have been able
to... it's an interesting fact that, yes, Switzerland was closed, but it was opened very quickly. The government said, except if you're going to Switzerland to die. It was only a very short time when they lifted it to allow people to go to Switzerland. When it was first announced, there was an uproar, and they very quickly did a U-turn on that. But you could only travel to Switzerland if you were going for an assisted death. So what would Geoff have done? Well, the options are not very big in you know, what you can do in this country. There really aren't. It's either
5 choices that I mentioned, isn't it? So
yes,
absolutely. Alison, you were at your mother's side virtually every day. I mean, how would you have been able to advocate for her if she'd been in a care home and you wouldn't have been able to get to her?
That's right. I think I would have missed out tremendously. Certainly my brother would have been able to be more helpful. He lived in the same state. but it was very, very helpful to him that I was with her, and he could come twice a week, you know, until he moved in with where I was. But I lived in her apartment and then went to her every day at the hospice home. But where she lived in the the retirement community shut its doors completely. I wouldn't have been able to stay there, of course. Same with my aunt. She was in an assisted living facility, which was very small, and everybody's very, very vulnerable. I wouldn't have been able to advocate for her. That would have required, flying more. She was in Washington, D.C. So that would have been torn from us. And I feel very, having been in Singapore for so long, and when my father was dying and I was flying back and forth a lot. And I remember talking to my friends about it and how very strongly they said to me, there's a real difference between expatriates who make it back for their parents' deaths and those who don't get there in time. And I think that's what we're probably feeling a lot here as a result of the COVID problem, is that people, it's not that they can't get there in time, they can't get there at all. So that's what I would have been feeling. That's definitely what I would have been feeling. And I'm also really, really happy that they didn't see all of this. I feel fortunate that they didn't. They were both my aunt and my mother were very liberal, open, loving, principled, humane people, and this would have been very, very sad.
And in contrasting, in fact, with your aunt, who I was interested in that. So whereas they sort of really faced their deaths and discussed them, she didn't, but you felt that was the right choice for her. Why was that?
There was no way around it for her. The more I think about it, the more I have to accept that her personality required that she be in denial. I mean, she loved being in denial. It was her favorite, you know, and so but the way my aunt kicked and screamed and was angry and regretful and was terrified of dying, made me want to help her find acceptance, but that wasn't the way she wanted to do it. She wanted to fight. But it meant that she couldn't choose, just her makeup didn't allow her to choose a peaceful death. But here's an interesting thing that finally is being discussed. What death actually looks like a normal death? And this is where I'm really grateful to people like Dr. Catherine Mannix and Dr. Rachel Clark and Atul Gawande for discussing what your average death looks like and how it's not necessarily that traumatic. And so there being a big difference between that, which might not be that frightening. If my aunt had been able to talk about it and we could have discussed how it was likely to be, because she would say, I just think it's going to hurt, you know? And then, and if there had been assisted dying, we could say, well, how about it doesn't?
Well, that's why it promotes the good conversations. And I know that
she wouldn't have them, though. She wouldn't have them.
No. Well,
it's painful.
What struck me from that is that there's a theme here of people wanting to die how they've lived.
Yes, that's true.
So there shouldn't be a one size fits all for dying. No, it's really got to be driven by the person themselves. I've got some questions coming in here. The first question is from Irene Richards. And I'm afraid that her son Gavin, who had cancer, took his own life in June of this year. Because he was so concerned about what would happen to his esophageal cancer. And she asks, how can we ensure that Matt Hancock's recent statement that consideration must be given to the question of assisted dying in this House, he means the House of Commons, be acted upon? I think I might pick that one up first, actually, as being involved in the campaign, leading the campaign. I mean, I think this has been a seismic year for Dignity in Dying's campaign, and there have been a couple of factors in that. I mean, first of all, we've seen real moves, real change in opinion from doctors. So the physicians have gone to neutrality. The GP's opinion has shifted dramatically from their previous survey 5 years ago. The British Medical Association survey shows that 61% of the 30,000 doctors surveyed don't think that the BMA has got the right stance of opposition to assisted dying. 50% of doctors support the idea of assisted dying themselves. They're actually personally supportive of it. So I think doctors have moved. I think overseas there's been a big move as well. So we're seeing more and more countries debating this. We've had the second state in Australia move. Tasmania's probably on the cusp of legalizing assisted dying in March of next year, and I hear that 2 more states, probably New South Wales and Queensland, are going to move as well. The big one was, of course, last month's referendum in New Zealand, where 65% of the population voted for a change in the law. And then in the Republic of Ireland, they're debating assisted dying as well. People, you know, a country that came so late to equal rights on an abortion, on equal marriage, you know, and they are debating it. There's a bill at the moment in the Dial. So it's you know, that's been really important, I think. And then for us, I mean, Irene refers to this debate in the House of Commons that was just last month, and it was absolutely pivotal. So Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health, said that assisted dying should be considered as part of end-of-life care. He said assisted dying is intrinsically linked to palliative care. And if it would be useful, the government could collect data on assisted dying. Now, I think it's the data point that's really important. And I think that's what goes to Irene's question, because I think we need to understand what data there is here. We know Britain is going to Switzerland every week, or at least was before the pandemic. But you know, how many other people are suffering rather than going? How many people can't afford to go? How many people are members of the Swiss operations that offer assisted dying? How many people are taking their own life here because they see no other options, and that's all they can do? So I think that's the way that we keep this issue on the agenda in the House of Commons, and we make sure that this debate comes back to the Commons, but informed with evidence, informed with data of what really is going on and what the blanket ban is doing to people. Anne, I don't know if you want to give us your reflections on that question from Irene.
Well, just summarize it very briefly, the real core of the about.
She was just saying, how do we keep this on government's agenda?
Well, it's public. It's very important that people realise that Switzerland is not an easy option. Everybody thinks, oh, off you go on holiday. It is not. It's horrendous. The paperwork and what I had to do. I wasn't allowed to bring his ashes back on the plane without getting all the legal documents. The police, the Swiss tax people were involved. I had to do all this myself. It is huge, and it is cruel, and that people like myself are put through this. It's very, until the public swathe is really, really heavy, and let's face it, MPs are meant to represent their constituents. And until some of those MPs realise that by not literally representing their constituents' wishes, but using their own, then we're going to have this divide. It's as if the House in this question is going in one direction and the country is going in another. Well,
you mentioned Geoff mentioned in his letter to MPs how most didn't support, but in the last 2 years, there's been a seismic change there as well.
There has, and I have noticed that the latest number of seats which have been filled by younger, for example, the Labour seats that were lost to, and I'm not really talking party politics here, I'm just talking MPs, but a lot of younger members have come into Parliament, and they're all very pro it.
Absolutely.
But the older MPs who've been in their seats from all parties for decades, they're thinking backwards. But the young people, I think they've seen it. They've seen their relatives suffer, and they don't want that sort of option not being to die peacefully, not to be available for themselves. So there is a seismic switch to change. Yes.
Alison, I've got another question here for you from David Smith, who is actually the CEO of Teesside Hospice. Do panel members feel hospices should have a role in this debate? And if so, how best do they think this should happen? What's your thoughts on that?
That's very interesting. Because from my experience with hospices is that they give comfort by making sure you know that your wishes will be seen to. that you will be respected. That was my experience with them. If it were me dying now, and I saw that hospices were given a role, I would think, you know, that it's going to then, am I going to then have to figure out which hospice is not going to support me? Like, how do I thought if I went to a hospice, they would help me die the way I wanted to. So that just my knee-jerk reaction to that, David, is you know, I thought, let's just have them do what we want, right? Isn't that what, that was my experience with the hospice situation with my parents and my aunt, that they were to be supported. That's what was going to happen. They were going to support my family's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
I really, that would be very interesting.
I know some people in palliative care feel that assisted dying flies in the face of palliative care and hospice care.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think back to the Cicely Saunders quote where she says, you know, the experience of watching loved ones die remains with those who are left behind is so important in terms of listening to what the individual wants. So I think it is congruent with palliative care values, but at the end of the day, let's be clear, this isn't about an either or. We want great palliative care and we want the choice of assisted dying.
Yeah.
And we know that assisted dying extends life. You know, it actually makes people stop worrying about it, as you two have both so eloquently said. It allows people to get on living when they know they've got the option there.
Well, I think you put it so. Yes, the government should get the data. Everybody should be listened to. But your book is so clear on the data. Your book is so very good on the data. And one of the things that's stayed with me for so long is the number of people every year who aren't comforted by palliative care. The palliative care has a limit. Mm-hmm. And it is excruciating for many people. And I think MND is a perfect case. What you and I have seen, and is that also can't be unseen. It's awful what I saw.
It's a burden to put on hospices, I think. I think assisted dying, because it can only be applied to people of mental competence, these people have to know what they want.
Yes.
If they can't, if they're not competent to make the decision, it's not possible for them to have assisted dying. But for people of mental competence, I'm quite sure they would prefer to die in their own homes, surrounded by their loved ones. But I think that the onus on hospices to have this would open all sorts of floodgates to all sorts of problems.
I don't think an onus on anybody to do this.
Yeah.
I think there should always.
But it's the person himself, person themselves, the woman.
Yeah, that's right. Patient centric.
The patient. Yes.
Let's broaden it out a little bit. I've got a question here about Frank, who says that I've seen some attacks on do not resuscitate orders recently in the media, and I'm worried that I won't be listened to at the end of life. What Frank's telling us is that he has got a do not resuscitate order, and he's glad he's got one, because he does not want to be resuscitated. He doesn't want that brutal intervention at this point in his life with his underlying health problems. And I have to say that I'm worried about that too, because some sections of the media do seem to be attacking do not resuscitate orders and using it as a proxy for advanced care planning or good conversations about how people want to die. And those are essential in your parents' deaths, weren't they, Alison?
Yes, I think that the do not resuscitate order is extremely important, because that is you're controlling your end. You're saying, I've gone unconscious. I've died in a way that, you know, I can now I'm not going to remember, but if you wake me up, man, you know, awful. I think that that's very important, but it is part of a bigger need for communication, isn't it? It's part of one of the things I've been reading about as well, because now I'm following a lot of palliative care doctors and hospice nurses and etc., is how much more they want to know about the person in order to do what is like, what were your hobbies? What can I talk to you about? What should I not talk to you about? All of these things, plus, oh, do not resuscitate, got it. But what else is there? That's not all of you. So that is in my parents' situation. It was a bigger picture communication. And and keeping that going. I think that that also speaks to what the question about what can we do to make sure that this becomes a debate at the highest level, is talk about it at every level. And just, if it's important to you, keep it open, surprise people. We're not famous here in this country for wanting to talk about it, but it can be done. It can be done very pleasantly, very, very pleasantly. And in fact, I find that just keeping my port, I mean, I'm like death central right now. My husband is like, who did I marry? When did our house become death central? But it can be quite interesting. And also, I've started very early saying, this is what I want. This is what I want. And let's check in again in some years, and we'll talk about it later. And it's light. It's light then. It's not as heavy. It doesn't have to be Sturm and Drang and you know, dramatic. It can be, hey, I saw something I liked.
I've got a question here from Joy. How might I go about looking for a care home or nursing home who would accept me, knowing full well that I plan to die by starvation in the future? What do you think, Anne? How would you have?
Well, that sums it up. I plan to die by starvation. The law in this country has just got to be changed. I mean, that's a terrible thing to think, that you're looking at this state knowing that dying by starvation is not an easy way to go. It can be horrendous. To me, that you know, says it all, really. That unless
it does. I agree that that's horrible. But under these conditions, if you
yes, we have no choice.
You have no choice.
You don't have money.
But you can. I don't know how you would go about finding a care home that supported that the same way you would go about finding a care home that allowed dogs. I mean,
you wouldn't say anything. Why do you think we get all those suicides every year that are linked directly to people who've been given from a terminal diagnosis? It's because they know that the end is going to be horrendous and they want to preempt it in the best way they can think of.
So maybe they couldn't afford a care home. I don't want to discourage people from talking to care homes about that being what you want.
Yes.
We don't all have to end up in care homes. My husband didn't go to a care home.
Correct.
But usually you were going to a care home because you've got nobody to look after you and you're incapable of looking after yourself. My husband was incapable of looking after himself, but he had me, and the carers were fantastic. And I had tremendous support from the National Health, with hoists and all the paraphernalia that you need. It was absolutely wonderful. What I didn't have when I took him to Switzerland was all that backing, which would have made it so much easier if he could have died in his own bed. It would have made life very much easier. And so I think this business about palliative care and hospices, yes, there's a huge place for it. And a large percentage of the population who do end up having palliative care have excellent treatment. But there's a significant minority who suffer and die dreadful deaths.
So I don't know if you know, Alison, that Dignity in Dying has got a sister charity called Compassion in Dying, which provides services at the moment for people to plan and talk about and record their wishes for the end of life, and gives patients a voice around how they want to approach these issues and how they want to talk about them. We've got a range of services, and in fact Compassion in Dying has looked after or helped 9,000 people this year make an advanced decision, talk about a loved one, try and get involved in these issues. And I'm interested in the point around taboo, because people often say, oh, death is a taboo, but actually people want to engage with this issue. They do want to talk about how they want to die when dying becomes a reality for them.
That's right.
They want to engage with this issue. They want to get into it. And I think that through organisations like Compassion in Dying, providing a voice for people, and for other homes, care homes, hospices, acknowledging the range of views and having this debate that brings these points out into the open. I think it's brilliant. I think it should be celebrated that the pandemic has caused more people to think about how they want to die and to plan ahead and to make a living will. and to put their wishes in writing.
I'd like to make a point about I agree that people do want to talk about it. Those who want to talk about it want to talk about it. You know, my aunt didn't want to talk about it. And you said you had a friend who
I did indeed.
couldn't bring himself to come to, like, supported assisted dying, but didn't want to talk about it.
That's right.
But one thing that I've noticed, it's not just trying to get our parents to talk about it with us. That's not always the problem. I think there's often a problem for older people who want to talk about it with their kids, and the kids go, "Oh, Dad, you'll live forever."
Well,
Come
kids
on.
are immortal. They're going to live forever. It's not until
and just putting a stopper in it. I think so. Those of you who are wondering how to raise the subject with your family, it may be that they actually want to raise it with you, and you've got to listen. You've got to listen and calm yourself. You cannot. They will die. You cannot assuage your own anxiety by telling them they're not going to die. You can only assuage your anxiety by helping them.
I think the problem is, at the moment, the context sort of mitigates against people having those conversations. It's the wall of silence point, isn't it? So there may well be people who don't want to discuss it, but there are an awful lot of people who do want to have these discussions. And it's about, you know, opening it up and enabling people to do it, whether it's through making a living will, whether it's discussing assisted dying. I mean, it's all so much as this cloak of secrecy over everything, which of course you came up against, Anne, you and Geoff came up against when...
Yeah, but that was the law. There wasn't, because, you know, people wouldn't have, but, and also we found people didn't know how to, knowing that Geoff was dying. These are friends that went back decades, but they didn't know how to talk to him about it. An interesting fact, our neighbour, very good friend, we're godparents, their children, he died a few months before Geoff was diagnosed. And Geoff used to go over and they'd have long talks. And his last talk with this gentleman, he actually asked him, "You're dying, and how do you feel?" And his widow told me afterwards, all Roger's friends would come and see him and chatter, but they'd talk about anything but dying. And Geoff came over and he had the best conversation with her. She said, "My husband felt it all came out," and they discussed it for about 2 hours. And I didn't know then, because before Geoff was diagnosed, but maybe Geoff had a premonition, but I don't know. But he had this conversation, which was of great solace to his widow. She told me afterwards, it really helped Roger, because he knew he was dying, you know, but nobody else, everybody else would talk about the football, anything but the fact that he's actually going to die.
Another practical thing, Alison, I was interested in your book. You advise, when communicating with family and friends about an emergency in relation to your parents, your mum in this case, well, no, it was your aunt, be open, be clear, write things down to each other. Don't just call. You'll want to double check the facts, I promise you. What other practical tips would you advise when a loved one is dying?
Well, we found it very, very useful to identify the people who were the tight group around my aunt, the tight group around my mother, you know, and made sure that we had an email group so that we could lean on each other. And then, well, the thing is, I was away, and that's the case now, because in COVID, even if you're in the next town, you're also away. So if one person has taken somebody to the doctor, have the report on that trip be via email, as well as a phone conversation, so you can, because in the moment, we always think we know what the other person is saying. We don't always know what the other person is saying. It's very nice to be able to do a search for that email and see, oh, it's actually been 3 weeks since then. It wasn't just last week you called me. You have to be able to do a search for all of the medical things that happened and when, because doctors are going to ask you all the time as well. I also did something that not everybody's going to want to do, and I recorded conversations. My mother was trying to express how she wanted the announcement of her death to be. She was trying to think of the words she wanted used, and I recorded it so that I could look at her and we could talk, and I could play that again for myself later.
All of your experiences seem to be predicated on excellent conversations with doctors and honesty from doctors. And I'm really interested in that, because in Last Rites, we talked about patients getting the building blocks of control. And really the kind of the first building block if you like, is honesty from doctors about what somebody's facing.
Yes.
And, you know, what the likely journey of their disease. But you seem to, and you know, some people don't get that with their doctors.
Right.
So why is it, do you think your doctors were so honest?
I think it's also because of what they got from my parents. And I suspect that Jeff was the same. My feeling from what you said about how clearly he wrote and how practical he was, that when he would talk to a doctor, that they knew what kind of patient he was. I think that my parents' doctors knew what kind of patients they were and would just say, because my parents weren't going to dilly-dally. And my parents were they were actually curious and sometimes amused. So I think I'm guessing that that's the case, was that they met my parents where they were.
We can't talk to doctors here about the option of an assisted death. No doctor will talk to you about it.
No, they didn't talk to they didn't talk about assisted death with these doctors.
So if you want that option,
honesty,
it's not something. No.
Yeah. No.
So
no, go ahead.
I'm getting lots of questions on this sort of theme from Lynn. I can see your statistic of 84% of people, of British public, support a change in the law. I don't think there's been any other subjects which have attracted such a consensus of support. But what can we do to help? There's been a lot of questions about how we can help with this debate. And I think that, it's really around making your views known. It's about talking to your MP. I mean, joining Dignity in Dying in our campaign, being clear about what your experiences are. I talk in the book, in Last Rites, about something that Terry Pratchett said to me once, and the reason why his books sold so well in the end, which was that it was really around, initially all his readers were like tiny little globules of mercury, and then over time they all came together, and their voices were magnified, and they became one big blob with real power. And he said that's what will happen to Dignity in Dying's campaign, that people will unify around this call. And I can see that happening. I can see that happening in Parliament with the doctors, overseas law change. But I think you have to add your voice. You have to stand up and be counted in answer to that question. So I wanted to ask you both what these experiences have taught you about your own deaths, and what you envisage as a good death, and what's it taught, what you do about your own deaths, both of you. Anne, do you want to start?
Well, of course, having seen that Jeff had a good death, I've had to face the fact that I'm, going to die sooner than certainly, presumably, you two will, but it's coming face to face with it. The good death that I had with Jeff's good death has made life so much easier for me. I've spoken to so many people who've experienced bad deaths with their loved one, and they're having nightmares 20 years on about loved ones who had dreadful end, and they have guilt complexes, all sorts of things. It never goes away. But I was lucky that Jeff, he was so brilliant. He organized it all, and he had a good quiet death earlier than he had to, because he had to go early. He could have lived for 2 or 3 more months, but the law didn't allow that. He had to travel. My death,
I'm going to have to cut you there, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry, but we're running out of time. It's my fault, but I'm going
I can afford it the same.
Just a couple of minutes, just a minute, if you wouldn't mind, Alison. I'm so sorry, but we've reached 4 already, nearly. So,
well, number one is I hope that there is it definitely has made me think more about my death, and I hope that there is an assisted dying option wherever I am. But what I'd like to say is, when after all of this happened, and my children, I had independent conversations with my kids, and both of them said to me, having seen you support your parents, and we can see how you want your death to be, and we've taken it in. And I said, no, that's how they wanted their deaths to be. All I'm asking is that you and I can talk about it as much as we talked about it. I don't know how I'm going to want to be when it happens, but I want to be able to tell you, and I want you to listen.
So it's
Yeah.
almost like you're handing down through generations the idea of how you want to go. What a lovely idea. But
Yeah.
themes of discussion, talking about it and control are running through this conversation. I'm sorry I couldn't answer more. We couldn't answer more of your questions. They've been flowing in thick and fast. But I really want to thank Anne and Alison for speaking so eloquently and so honestly today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
If you'd like to buy either Last Rites or Absolutely Delicious, then there are links to do so in the chat function here and the email that we'll send out to all participants afterwards. And we've included seasonal discount codes as well, if you'd like to use them for stocking fillers. Can I ask you to post reviews if you read the book, because it really helps them to reach new audiences. And finally, I just want to say, I really hope that you have a relaxing break and come back refreshed for the new year, because for those who are involved with Dignity in Dying's campaign and for those who would like to get involved, we have a very busy programme of work planned for next year. So thank you all for coming, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.